Welcome to Ask the Hiring Manager. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask the Hiring Manager. Today we have Greg Morley with us. Greg is president of BSL International, consultant in the HR, diversity, inclusion, and belonging space, and he is an advisory board member for Simmons University Institute for Inclusive Leadership. Greg has over 25 years of HR experience with previous roles including regional HR director and global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Moet Hennessy, as well as vice president of human resources at both Hasbro and at Disney. His career has brought him from the US to France, then on to Hong Kong and Shanghai in Asia for 17 years, and most recently back to Paris, my favorite city in the world. Greg is also the author of an upcoming book, Bond: Inclusion and Keys to Belonging and Connection. It's so great having you here, Greg.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Leslie, and thank you for not making me do this in French, which I know you would be much more confident at than I would.
Exactly. We talked about it before. Maybe one day. So
I'll keep practicing.
Exactly. So your recruiting experience and HR career started at Disney, which is obviously a very well-known and great company at which to start your HR career. So tell me more about what you did while at Disney.
So the first job I had in HR was actually as a generalist, and I was invited by the person I was working with to take on an HR job, and I really had no HR experience. I did reflect back on when I was working at GE, and the person I was working with at the time had mentioned to me, "Hey, at some point you should get into HR. I think you'd be good at HR." And at the time, I didn't know if he meant I'd be good at HR or I just wasn't very good at what I was doing and I should do something else. So when I got to Disney and I was asked if I would be interested to take on the HR role, I thought, okay, there's something to that. So I started in a generalist role at Epcot, which was an organization that had at the time, about 7,000 employees. And so it was a bit of like giving the keys to somebody without a driver's license. So I immediately decided to go and get a master's in HR, which I did. And through that process, learned that I actually knew a lot more about HR than I had given myself credit for. And soon after that, I went from that role into a recruiting role, where I was responsible for all of the college and international recruiting at Walt Disney World. And Walt Disney World at the time had a model where, because of the seasonality of the business, it was really important to have interns from all around the country and also around the world to come to work at Walt Disney World. So it was really sort of the perfect job to start in terms of recruiting, because I loved it and I had a sort of an aspiration to work outside the US at some point in my life. And that was really how I got my start down that path.
Very cool. And you mentioned recruiting as well. So how was your recruitment experience helpful in preparing for your HR career?
I was fortunate in my HR career to have done all of the functional jobs within HR. I was fortunate to know that some of them I was good at and I liked, and some of them I was not very good at and didn't like very much. Recruitment has always been a passion for me. And so I was really fortunate to have started in recruitment. I love the energy of bringing people into an organization. And I think it's one of the things I'm so impressed with this effort of yours in this podcast, which is for people to show up at an interview, to prepare for an interview, it's not easy. And for those of us that are in HR or in the recruitment space, I think we get a little bit numb to the difficulty of interviewing and preparing for interviews and doing well. It's not a sort of natural skill or habit for people. And frankly, it's not a natural skill or habit for hiring managers either. It's not what they do most of the day. And so, kudos to you for doing this, because I think it takes the mystery out of it, maybe some of the anxiety out of it for people to learn from, different experts to what makes a good interview and how can I get that job that I really want and I love.
Of course, and thank you for your appreciation of it. And you're right. I think that by having amazing people like you on, other hiring managers and experts in the HR field, as you mentioned, kind of alleviating that anxiety. Also getting to know a person. I mean, HR managers are real human beings. They're
Yes, they are. Most of us are, yes.
yes, most of us, yeah. Most right, most are. So also feeling like, oh wow, this person, especially in a interview like what we're having today, where you really get to know the person, and now it's not a formal job interview, but applicants get a sense of, oh wow, this is a human. All of the people, all of my guests I've had on are very warm individuals. So like you said, it kind of takes that anxiety piece out. So thank you for
Well,
appreciating
thank
that.
you for including me. Yeah, I think oftentimes in the interview process, we lose a bit of the humanity of the process, and it's really a human to human interaction, and that's where people shine or don't shine when they bring their own authenticity and humanity. And it's the same on the other side, whether it's a hiring manager or an HR director or HR individual who's hiring, to remember what it's like to be in the other person's seat. And I think
Yes.
that always makes for a much more productive and enjoyable experience for applicants and for people that are hiring.
100%. I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. Great. We have so many things to talk about. I'm like, I want to go in so many different areas. Exactly, which is what I love about talking with you. So, you mentioned Disney, of course, and before I go into LVMH, when we talked initially, I believe you mentioned to me that you were part of a team responsible for hiring 16,000 people, if I'm not mistaken, in 4 months.
Correct.
That's obviously huge. It sounds like a daunting task. How did you go about achieving that?
So a little bit about my journey. When I was after working in college international recruitment, I worked at Disney Cruise Line, which was also an adventure in recruitment, because my experience to that point was hiring people for, store manager roles or servers in restaurants, and people that were working in merchandise shops and hotels, and all of the people that you would see and interact with at a Disney theme park.
Sure.
And then I moved to Disney Cruise Line, and I was all of a sudden responsible for recruiting chefs, technicians in shows, engineers, people who work on the deck of a ship, all of these kinds of officers that was really new to me. And it opened my eyes very much to the really amazing world of recruitment, and what types of careers you were helping people to create. And in Disney Cruise Line, it was specifically meaningful because a lot of the people who were working on the ships came from places which were, much less well off than the US. So these shipboard roles were really life changers for them and their families. So I
Hmm.
really enjoyed that. Fast forward to moving to Disneyland. And at the time I joined Disneyland, uh, Disneyland was opening a new hotel and a second theme park, and a nighttime entertainment complex, nighttime dining entertainment complex. And so we had to hire 16,000 people in about 4 months,
Wow.
which seemed at the time to everyone to be an impossibility. At the time in that part of Southern California and Orange County, I think the unemployment rate was 2%.
Oh
So
my gosh.
there was no way we were going to just put up advertisements and get people to come. So my view always was, we're going to have to hire people who already have jobs, and
Yes.
we're going to have to get everybody involved with getting people to come and interview. So it wasn't going to be just an effort of the HR team or the recruitment team to hire 16,000 people. It would have been an impossibility. So a lot of the way that happened, and we actually hired more than 16,000 people, which was a big relief and a success of the team, was we had a lot of employee referral.
Mm.
And the good thing about working at Disneyland is, for the most part, people had great experiences working there. So they were very happy and oftentimes very proud to have the opportunity to say, if I came home and said, "Hey, Leslie, there's this great job at Disneyland. I think you should go and apply for it." They could do that very with a lot of pride and a lot of confidence. That if you went there and interviewed and got the job, you'd have a good experience. So that helped a lot in the process of really, doubling the size of the company in a very short period of time.
Wow. Yes. I mean, the fact that, and did you all successfully achieve that? I was curious.
Yeah, we ended up actually hiring more people than we had anticipated. The part of the 16,000 was, probably about 12,000 people we actually needed in the jobs, and then you had to think about turnover, and then you had to be replacing all of those summer jobs that I had been tasked with working on in Florida. So it all just was like a recruitment bomb at the same time.
Yeah.
And it really was a tremendous experience, and one of the, I think, best experiences is in my HR career, notably because of the team I had working in
Mm.
recruitment, in HR, and the management team, and just the whole cast of employees who felt like they all owned this new chapter of reopening the Disneyland Resort and bringing their friends and family to work there. I'll tell you one quick story.
Yeah.
We had a interview. We used to do huge job fairs in the convention center. I mean, we'd have thousands of people coming through the job fairs. It was really a machine. And at one point, somebody said, "Hey, I just interviewed somebody who worked here on opening day in 1955.
Oh my gosh.
She worked as I don't know, in the summer or maybe a couple summers. And then she went on and had children and grandchildren. And she had seen that we were hiring. And so she came back and interviewed. And she ended up working there again on the opening day of the second park.
Oh my God. How cool is
And
that? Talk
these kinds
about,
of stories are just so, I think, so touching, so meaningful, and also highlighted, I think, what an important part of that, part of California Disneyland has in the heart of people.
yes. Talk about full circle.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's amazing.
That's a great story. That was a wonderful story. You've also worked, as mentioned, with LVMH, otherwise known as Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton. And I know LVMH has like 70 or so luxury brands, a lot of luxury brands, which I find awesome. Of
Yes,
course,
me
I
too.
appreciate that. What was your function while at LVMH? What did you do there?
So I joined LVMH in Hong Kong. My voyage with Disney I left California, I went to France, and then I went to Hong Kong with Disney, and ultimately left Disney, worked at Hasbro, and then I started with LVMH, Moet Hennessy, which is the luxury wines and spirits part of the group of the LVMH group. So they have brands like Dom Perignon and Hennessy and Veuve Clicquot, Belvedere vodka, Glenmorangie whiskey. So it's a pretty full portfolio of really, I would say, luxury product.
Sure.
I joined there in 2019 as the head of HR for Asia Pacific. In Asia Pacific, we had 12 countries, 12 companies within the Asia Pacific region, and about 1,500 employees across the region, mainly in commercial functions, so sales, marketing, finance, HR, supply chain, and in a period of very rapid pre-COVID growth.
Mm,
Um, about a year into my time in that role, sort of just as I was figuring out things, and just when I figured out where the bathrooms were, they asked me then to take on as a side gig the diversity, equity, and inclusion role, of which there had not been anybody in that role prior to my assuming that role and building a strategy with a team and launching that. So that was how I spent sort of the first 4 years of my time at LVMH and Moet Hennessy before coming back to Paris in June of 22.
oh, very nice. And what attracted you? I know you mentioned getting into the diversity and inclusion space. What attracted you to diversity and inclusion work, or what do you like about it?
So I had been responsible for diversity and inclusion way back when I was at Disneyland, and it was one of the functions of recruitment. And at that point, diversity inclusion was just diversity. And it was very much about hiring a more diverse workforce that was reflective of the guests that were coming into the park,
Sure.
and also to tap into underserved and under-recruited communities. So it was a relatively limited scope. What always attracted to me about diversity and inclusion was the inclusion bit. And it's sort of what eventually inspired me to write the book that I'm working on. Because to me, coming into an organization and feeling like you belong there, you've been invited in, you're in a safe place, you can do good work, people recognize you for what you do. I think that's really the magic of it. And in that way, anybody can be a practitioner of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Hmm.
Managers can, coworkers can, subordinates can. And so I was always very attracted by that because in my HR experience, having worked in different locations, different cultures, different companies, when you saw inclusion practiced well and belonging in practiced well, you saw the impact on the organization and the positive impact on results of the organization. Number one, you also saw that individuals could thrive in that organization and thrive in that environment. And, to me, for leadership, the number one thing is to create an environment at work where people can do their
Hmm.
best work, be their best selves. Now, I can't control what happens when they go home. I can't control what happens in the drive home or the car or the train ride home or the subway home or what happens when they're at home. But what I can try to control with my colleagues is when they're at work, they feel like they can be their best.
Yes.
And that I think is what inclusion we should be striving to accomplish with inclusion work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've recruited and hired for diverse positions over the course of your very accomplished career. I can say it for you.
Thank you.
Um, how would your interview questions or the things you were looking for in an applicant vary from position to position? I know you've had a range of different types of positions that you've hired, for which you've hired.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at some point there are some commonalities in what I would look for when I'm speaking with somebody in an interview. And, there's something about a passion to do the job and to work in that organization. And that's really important, whether you're an intern, whether you're somebody who's going to be there 6 months, 9 months, or you think you're going to run your whole career in an organization, that you seem to feel something about the company and you seem to have done some work to understand what the organization's culture is like, and you're curious. So, for people that I think show up well in an interview, they're as curious about the company and about me and about the team they're going to work on as I am about them.
Mm,
And when that curiosity comes through, regardless if they're a senior executive or an intern, I think that that's a great starting point for any interview. And then, of course, you have to sort of get into the specific, excuse me, of the job. So if you're an intern, how quickly can you learn things? How resilient are you at the work? Where does this lead you? Where do you see this leading you? If it's a senior executive, I want to know a lot more about what they've done in those roles, what their philosophy and leadership is, how they bring out the best in their colleagues and their peers and their organization. Those kinds of things I think are really important because at a senior level, you represent others a lot more than it is at a junior level where you very much representing yourself. And I
yes,
think that those things are important to establish in any interview.
absolutely. And are there, with looking at these diverse type of applications and resumes, overall across the board, were there any general pros, cons that would stick out to you when reviewing applicant resumes?
Good question. Well, the first thing that we try to do more and more now is to create an applicant flow that's much less biased. So oftentimes in wherever you're recruiting, you'll have, especially outside the US, a lot of times people will put pictures on a resume.
That's true.
And regardless of how inclusive somebody believes they are, that can create a bit of bias, unconscious bias. Same can be true in other places. In the US, someone can have a bias because they see someone's name and it triggers them to think of something else. So we try to do more and more blind resumes, blind CVs to really understand what's the core of that person's experience and what do I want to know about them in terms of this role. I always believe that the more junior you are, the more straightforward your CV or your resume should be.
Yes.
Of course, it still shocks me when I receive a resume that has things like misspelling, it's not formatted correctly, and those kinds of things. So if nothing else, when somebody comes in as an intern, my view to them always is you have basically the same experience as everyone else. You might have done a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that, but when you're just coming into the workforce, you more or less have the same experience as everybody else. So showing up in a very authentic, engaging, curious way is probably your competitive advantage in an interview, because your resume is maybe going to get you in the door, but it's not going to win you the job.
Right.
On the other end of the spectrum, for people who are interviewing at the more senior roles, really understanding what the impact they had on a business they worked in or a team they worked with, and telling the story in a resume is important. Oftentimes people will create resumes that are just a bullet list of 30 things that they've done.
Sure.
Everybody's done a lot of things at work, otherwise they wouldn't be employed. That's for your job. But what are the things that made you unique? What were the things that were the reason the company you worked for before kept you? What were the things you're particularly proud of? I think those are things when I talk to leaders, I want to know more about. And oftentimes in a resume, that's important. I just, as a very recent example, we're recruiting for my replacement at Moet Hennessy. And we received, we posted the job internally, we received 150 resumes.
Oh.
So that's great, which means there's a lot of interest in the company and there's a lot of interest in the role. And there are 150 very qualified, mainly very qualified, talented people. So we have to go through with the recruitment team and say, okay, these are 3 or 4 things that are really important to this role. Then let's go into each CV and see, do we see that in there? Or do we not? Is it the level that we're looking for? Does the person represent themselves in a way that we would want them representing themselves in the company, representing the company? So all of those things are important.
Yes, absolutely. Those are good things to think about. I'm glad you mentioned them. And also, which I will definitely back that you said, in terms of, as you mentioned, many people in a role doing a list of bullets because of what they generally do on a day-to-day basis. But as you mentioned, and as I'll emphasize as well, yes, like for applicants or people updating your resume, make sure to really focus on those highlights, those achievements, those things that, as you also hit upon, make you stand out, the impact, as you mentioned, that an individual makes, especially if they're past the intern level, on the business. And yes, because anyone, like you said, you wouldn't be employable if you weren't doing a lot of things every day in the job, but really focusing on what's different than the day-to-day tasks. How did you, by how much did you increase business development? By how, depending on the role, by how much did you make impact? And what ways did you make impact over and above the day-to-day, responsibilities of the job? So I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that's something I work a lot with clients on naturally, to really help make them stand out. So I appreciate.
I think it's also important to be interesting.
Yes.
Because as I said, like with 150 CVs, what makes candidate X interesting or versus candidate Y, or not even versus candidate Y, but on their own. And I think that's always important, again, with people who are who are applying for interns, because it's hard to one up the person next to you with experience.
Yes.
If you're interesting and you're curious and you seem authentic and genuine, I think that really goes a long way in people securing jobs early on in their career. And then, of course, you can build on that with your own experience or behaviors and values in an organization.
You're right. You're right. Authenticity goes a very long way. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I consider you very authentic. So I can see where you
My best.
how you progressed in your career. But no, people generally like that, like
Yeah.
that feeling of, like you said, you can have, 150 great applicants with even great experience. But what really sets them apart and that kind of extra something, je ne
Yeah.
sais quoi.
Je ne sais quoi. And also, I think that that goes to being for someone to understand what the culture of the organization is, because if it's an organization of very sort of like the organizations I've worked in, they were very consumer-facing
Mm,
organizations. People had to deal with customers, clients, guests, whether they were at the front of the house or the back of the house. That was just the way it worked. And so that's a certain kind of profile and a certain type of personality. So knowing what you're getting into in an interview is important. If you're not comfortable with that or you don't think you're good at it and you're not interested in it, then don't do it because
yeah.
science teaches us that when you're like something and you're drawn to it, you're much more likely to be good at it. And if you're trying to, like I did when I was first in university, tried to take accounting classes because my father was an accountant. I thought that was the right
Mm.
thing to do. And then it was a horrible experience and I wasn't good at it. It's because I didn't like it. I just was following a path I thought was prescribed. So I think that again, in researching organizations when you're interviewing or preparing for an interview, that you really understand it. And if you're going to interview for a company that has say as a retail company, go to the shops, walk
Mm.
around, get a sense of the people. Who are they? Like, how do they interact with me? What's unique about this place? And I remember when I was interviewing for Moet Hennessy, I went out to different LVMH boutiques. I visited a Louis Vuitton boutique. I visited a Dior boutique. Now, they're slightly different
I'll do
businesses, but
that for you.
yeah, I know. It's not that hard to do it, but it's important because when somebody says, what do you know about the company? And you can say,
Yeah.
oh, I was in, one of your stores last weekend, and here's some things I
Mm.
picked up about the way people interact. I mean, that's like, okay, you sort of have made your interview,
Yes.
because surprisingly, very few people do that.
I'm
They
not
do
surprised that very few people do that, but I know what yeah.
They'll do the most people will do the research and they'll understand the company's financials and these kinds of things, but going and interacting and experiencing, I think it's important. And you could end up going and saying, I don't like this. I don't want to do this. This isn't the kind of organization. Great. Everybody wins when there's a common understanding.
Very true. And as you mentioned, yes, that hands-on experience is key. And I think that's good. Really great advice that you're giving. I don't think it's something that a lot of people think about, applicants to jobs or even people sometimes even more experienced in their career. So I think that's a really great tip. And like you said, if someone were to come in and say, "Oh, I was in an authentic manner, of course, but oh, I was just in this, the Dior shop, and I noticed this," and
Yeah.
especially for the type of job you mentioned you were hiring for at LVMH. That does. It's kind of like, okay, check points, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, this person is invested in this process. They're
Yes.
invested in coming here and they want it.
Yes.
That's that sort of desire to want it.
Yes.
The first 3, 6, 9 months, 12 months in a new company are not always easy. And
Hmm.
so you need a certain amount of desire and resilience to get through that onboarding and induction and a full sense of belonging to an organization. And I think hiring managers look for that somebody can sort of survive the bliss of the hire, and then the valley of the understanding of it's not that easy, and you're trying to figure things out and meet people and feel like you fit in. And so again, that sort of somebody has already thought through those kinds of things, I think is means a
Yeah.
lot to hiring managers and to HR people.
Absolutely. And that it shows that the applicant is thinking ahead, curious, as you mentioned, invested.
Mhm.
It's just great across the board. So that's an amazing, I think a really value add tip that you just gave. You've had an extensive career, obviously, working abroad. What advice or tips would you give to someone looking to work abroad in general? And I'm also curious, what you may address, is it necessary to have previous work or study abroad experience if one wants to work abroad as well?
Great question. And I sort of reflect on my own career. I remember not that long ago, I was going through some old stuff that I had. And I remember trying to contact somebody in the UK when I was working in the call center in Florida uh, to say, hey, are there any roles there? I'd be interested to do that. But when I think about that, and it's advice I give people, that it's just like your intern experience, that you have to have something that's a competitive advantage.
Mm,
So if somebody wants to work overseas outside of their home country, to me, the most effective route, it's a little bit longer term. You have to think a bit longer term, but is to work for a company that has a global footprint.
mm.
Join that company, do well, make sure everybody in the company knows that your aspiration is to work outside your own country at some point. So at some point, it can happen soon or it can happen never. But if everybody knows that's what your aspiration is, it will likely happen at some point, because the reality is not everybody wants to work outside their home country
True.
for whatever reason, for family reason, or they're not interested in that part of their career. So I think that that's the most effective way to create a path. And then once you're in a company that has that, raise your hand for projects, raise your hand for the thing that other people don't want to do. And that's how I ended up in France the first time, which was
Ah.
a woman I worked with was going on sick leave, and she recommended that I take the job. And I had colleagues who said, bad idea, short-term role, probably won't end up well. And I was like, okay, that sounds like all the recipe for a good experience.
You're like me.
And so yeah, so go for the things that other people may not want to do. If you have you have to have a bit of courage to do it, and you also have to believe that each experience is additive, and if it doesn't work out, you can regroup.
That's
So
very
I think
true.
that that's one path. The second path is the less secure, but also has merits to it, which is, let's say I want to work in France and I'm in New York, go to Paris
Yes.
and just find a job, any job, and start to build from the ground up. That I think that is also a way to do it. It works. It's a little bit more nerve-wracking. Like for me, I would not want to do it that way, but it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
Because again, you create a situation where a company who's hiring you has a very low acquisition cost. You're
Mm,
already there. Hopefully,
right.
you're learning or you speak the language. It's a lot easier for them to say, yeah, we'll hire you, rather than, well, they have to move you from New York and then you come to Paris. Plus, you've already established that you can survive there.
Mm.
And so I think that that's a second way to create an international career and follow that path, which for me has been an incredibly enriching career and life. It's not just for me, it's for my husband and our families, and they've all benefited from the careers that we've had overseas.
Yes. And I mean, any excuse to go to Paris.
Yes,
I'm biased, of course,
I know
but
you're biased, but yeah, and you and I have talked about Paris, and again, I say that it may surprise people that not there aren't thousands of people who want to work outside their home country,
yeah.
whether it's Americans going abroad or British going abroad or Chinese going abroad. You think about all of the complexities of life, children, parents, companies, whatever it is, there's a limited number of people who want to do that. So that's why I say publicize in a company where you work if that's what you want to do. Make sure everybody knows it.
Mm.
I had a situation one time when I was in Hasbro, and a guy that was working for the company in Australia, his parents or grandparents were Korean. I couldn't remember what. And he said, I was doing my first visit to Australia, and he said, at some point I'd like to work. I've had imagined working in Korea. And I said, well, do you speak Korean? He said, no, I don't speak Korean. And I said, okay, well, what I always say to people is like, keep telling people that you're interested in that. And at some point, maybe something will happen. I kid you not, like a month later, he was in marketing. The marketing manager in Korea resigned. And we were like, oh, we have somebody who wants to do the job.
Wow.
We need some outside Korea experience to help refresh the team. And so he ended up going to Korea. But
Look at
it
that.
was not like some kind of Wizard of Oz behind
Sure.
the curtain doing some kind of process. It was because he advocated for himself, and people knew what he wanted to do, and he was top of mind.
Oh, that's great. And I think, like you said, like self-advocacy is important. I know that it's interesting. One of my former guests works with like a platform, works with different companies on delivering a training that helps a lot of the employees in different areas. And I kind of sat in on that training, and which really interesting, really cool. And so one aspect which I say for better or for worse in kind of a joking manner, but I think it's actually good. But is one thing that I'm not shy to is a good level of self-advocacy in a balanced
Yeah.
way. But it is interesting how that was one of the topics of the presentations that my guest and connection had given to this cohort. And it's something, and a lot of the cohort were working for corporate enterprises. Um,
Mm.
and it's interesting how, yes, a lot of employees or maybe individuals in general kind of shy away from, or it's not something that some individuals feel comfortable with, the self-advocacy part. And there's a way to advocate. I think sometimes it's in that specific presentation when my guest was getting feedback, the hiring manager that I was interviewing
Mm.
was getting feedback from her cohort. A lot of people felt like shy or like they're boasting, like the boasting came up. There's a way to self-advocate without doing it in an arrogant manner, as you mentioned with that gentleman who mentioned, hey, I want to work in Korea and this is what
Yeah.
I want to do. And so I think self-advocacy is, and of course in a balanced way, is very in an attractive manner, is very important, as you mentioned, because how are you
Exactly.
going to get to a certain level if people don't know about it, especially those that can directly help to advance you? We're not saying just going around aimlessly telling people,
Yeah.
but so I think that's an aspect that I'm really glad you brought up because that's really important. I think a lot of people overlook that, especially when they're trying to progress within their career.
Yeah. It's the basis of career management is doing a good job.
Yes.
That makes you ultimately attractive to your boss, your team members, and other people who may be interested in you because you'll develop a reputation for doing a good job.
Yes.
But the self-advocacy part is important because, I mean, let's face it, if somebody is working for a manager and is very good at their job, the instinct of the manager is to hold on to that person.
Mm.
And so there's a higher purpose in leadership, which is to develop people and help them to fulfill their higher purpose. But that's not always the first reaction. So I think it's important that, you know, self-advocacy and helping others to help you is important. And holding at some level, holding other people accountable to helping you. It's
Yes.
just like going into the interview. You go into an interview, it's not a natural environment. It's not like we don't all sit around every day pumping ourselves up and trying to sell ourselves to other people. That's just not that's not the
Yeah.
natural the way. So the interview is just the start in your career, and you need to be, try to be comfortable in that kind of forum, in that setting, because it will happen. That interview thing will happen over and over and over in your career. And it's interesting in certain organizations I've been in where you have very long tenure people, and you may have had a restructuring, and then people have to interview for new jobs, and they're completely out of practice in advocating for themselves. And of course, we help them and we help to train them to do that. But it's a skill and it's a muscle, and it has to be developed as you're developing your career.
Very true. Very true. What advice would you give to someone looking to change jobs? I know we talked about living abroad, but I'm curious in terms of changing jobs, even right here in the US. What are some things that a person looking to change jobs should be thinking about or doing?
Hmm. There's a couple of things I think are really good questions to ask yourself, and ask the person who you're interviewing with. Remember that an interview is a two-sided opportunity to learn. And
Mm,
so, yes, it's an opportunity to present yourself, but once you get the interview, it's also an opportunity to learn. So I think for somebody who's looking to change jobs, the understanding of the culture of the organization for which they're curious is really important, because the culture fit, culture match is, I think, of primary importance. If it's an organization that is, very highly value-based, or as I said before, one where people are encouraged to be out and about, and if that's not who you are, then I think it's not so healthy to force yourself into those kinds of things.
mm.
I think it's always also interesting to understand what happened to the person who was in the job before you. You
Yeah.
know, that's advice that it was given to me before I took my last job, and I thought, oh, that's really good advice to say. However you figure that out, whether you ask in the interview or you figure it out some other way, to understand, what is this organization all about? How do they work? How do they treat people? Um, you know, if I take this job, what does it mean for me? Where can I go from that?
Mm,
All of those kinds of things are super important. The changing job dynamic is, I think we underestimate the challenge in the actual change of the job, because we get so excited about a new job. But there's this process of, again, like inducting yourself and including yourself and feeling like you have friends at work. That takes time. And it's maybe another thing to consider when somebody's thinking about changing jobs or changing careers is, what do I have now in an organization?
mm.
Is there a way for me to change a job and a career in the same company? I worked in Disney for 17 years. I had like 14 different jobs in four different countries.
Wow.
So my career was constantly being refreshed. Yet I was in the same organization, and I knew the organization, I knew the people. And so I also encourage people to think twice before leaving, because there may be a path where you are that could be new and exciting and developmental, and potentially outside your own country or whatever you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, even within the same company.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's triggered me to another question kind of related to internal versus external, but even on the hiring manager side, do you feel it's more effective for a hiring manager to hire someone internally to fill a role, or do you feel that sometimes it can be better to hire externally?
Yes and yes. So it's a matter of what the organization is trying to do. I would say, and I'm very proud of the fact that the organizations I worked with would defer to internals.
Hmm.
And the reality is, if I would say this to hiring managers all the time, if you have a candidate who's internal in the organization and they're, say, within 6 months of being able to take the job, hire them, because you're going to hire somebody from outside and it's going to take them just as long to be fully effective in the job, maybe longer. And it's always, I think, good to recognize the talent that we have in an organization. That being said, oftentimes you want to pivot. An organization may want to bring in somebody who has different experience. When I joined Disney, I had only worked for GE. I didn't have any hospitality experience. I didn't have any experience in hotels or theme parks. That was why they hired me, because I had a different perspective to bring into the organization. And I think that's also the power of a diverse organization, that you bring people who have different experiences with their work career, life experiences, and they can make change happen, or they can refresh a mindset, or bring a company to a new level. So I think hiring managers have to think about that. What I would caution hiring managers to do is, oftentimes we think the external candidate are all good and the internal candidates are all lacking. And that's just not the case. It's, if you put everybody more or less at the same level, then you have to think about, okay, what experiences, skills, and competencies do I need in this job? And then start to evaluate the candidates that you have, both internal and external.
I like that. Okay. Yeah, it's a nice kind of view of both, because there are pros and cons of either. But I like
Yeah,
that
exactly.
even Disney, and like as you mentioned, with all the roles that you had internally, that company, especially at the time you were there, was very big on not overlooking, right, the
Yeah.
internal talent, but also knowing in events where sometimes it could be maybe better to hire externally as well.
Of course, of course.
Yes. And we talked about self-advocacy earlier. So as a segue, and I see this wonderful poster behind you. You have a book that you're working on currently, Bond, as I can see there, Inclusion and Keys to Belonging Connection. I'm curious, what is the book about, or as much as you want to say about the book?
Yeah, there's no secrets. So the book, I started writing the book during COVID, so it's a bit of a COVID baby.
Mm,
And I'm just really intrigued by the impact of inclusive environment. And, back to a bit of what I said earlier, which is, I believe that people want to show up at work, and they want to feel safe at work, and they want to feel valued at work, and they want to feel recognized and properly paid, and they want to feel like they're developing and they're going somewhere. And my feeling is that the discussion around diversity and inclusion has gotten too much of winners and losers, right and wrong. Of course, there's some right and wrong in the world. I don't mean to say there's not. Most people show up to diversity and inclusion work wanting to do better, wanting to learn more, wanting to move along a spectrum of being a more inclusive leader, a more inclusive colleague, a more empathetic leader who creates a sense of belonging in an organization. So the book is about that and helping people go along that journey. And it's a lot of storytelling from my own career and others who joined me in the book to share their stories and their careers. And I hope that it's a very approachable book that people can say, okay, I see myself in that situation. There's something I can pick up from what that person did, that I can help to build a more inclusive and diverse and belonging organization.
I love that. I love that. I feel like all aspects, you mentioned diversity, inclusion, and the belonging aspect are super important, because despite the kind of, in my opinion, despite the external kind of external, what we think of as diversity inclusion, whether that's different genders, ethnicities, nationalities, etc. I think it's great to have diversity in that aspect. But no matter the level of kind of external, factors of diversity, I think the belonging is also very important, because you can have a very multicultural
Yeah,
and kind of mixed in a way workplace. But if no one's feeling heard, if no one's feeling like they belong, okay, then we may be meeting the numbers, but
yeah,
not
exactly,
having
exactly.
that empathy aspect. So if I'm not mistaken, it sounds like your book kind of hits on different facets, and I like the fact that belonging is also emphasized, because that's super important, I feel.
Yeah. And there's a spectrum, I think, of sort of tolerating difference to accepting difference to really getting the best out of people. And that's
Yeah.
what we want in environments where people are recognized for who they are. They can be who they are, but they also can work with other people and they can create a unit that's really performing and dynamic. And that's not always easy because you'll hear people say, "Oh, everybody, I don't see difference. Everyone is equal to me." Well, the reality is we are different.
Yeah, there
And if you
are.
don't appreciate that and you don't know the keys to how to bring that to life, then you lose a lot of I think intellectual and emotional capital. And when people can move along that curve to really appreciate difference and really leverage difference, I think that's where belonging happens and inclusion happens and where great things happen in organizations.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. So, how can people get their hands on your book as well as keep up with all the awesome projects you have going on?
So the book will be launched in June. Fingers crossed. It will be available on Amazon. And so you'll be able to search for the title Bond and you'll be able to find the book there. And I hope to be able to do a bit more promotion when it's actually finally launched. So I'm as courageous I am as a person who moves around the world and takes different jobs and some crazy environments. I'm a little bit cautious until the thing's done to start to promote it. But my intention is actually to launch it in June, first in Hong Kong, then in Europe and the
Oh,
US. But
wow.
at that time, will be available on Amazon.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm looking forward to checking it out.
Thank
And
you.
I love the title. I mean, I understand the reasoning, especially the topic. And I love that it's Bond, it sounds like
Yeah, sounds a
uh,
bit. I think people might pick it up for different reasons, but that's all
exactly.
fine.
Exactly. Any PR
The
is good
intention
PR.
is to the intention is to positively influence the conversation. So that's
Yes.
for whatever reason they pick it up. I hope that it moves the conversation forward.
Exactly. PR is PR, so anything. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to checking that out. And I'm so blessed and really honored to have had you here and had this wonderful discussion. Such a value add you've been to this discussion. And yes, I definitely value all your input, and I'm sure all of our viewers out there do as well. So thank you again for coming on, Greg.
Thank you, Leslie. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and I know we will continue to get to know each other.
Absolutely. We definitely will. And I have yet another excuse to come to Paris.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in. Stay tuned to the next episode. Bye. Welcome to Ask the Hiring Manager. I'm Leslie Hunter, president of Resume Makeover. I've been helping job seekers for nearly a decade to acquire their dream jobs and achieve the income they desire, from entry-level applicants to C-suite executives and everyone in between. From your resume to your cover letter, LinkedIn profile, bio, or website content, I'm here for you. And now I'm going to open the door and interview some of the top hiring managers so that you can have the insight that you need to book the jobs that you want. Welcome to Ask the Hiring Manager.